Thank you, Jamie. I'm very pleased to be the chair of this opening panel. When I first saw the title, The European System Dream or Nightmare, it occurred to me that might well have been the last panel of the conference, the concluding session, where we would discover whether it was a dream or a nightmare. But it's also equally useful to begin the discussion with some differing opinions about that subject. And as I read some of the papers sent by members of this distinguished panel, I think we're going to hear at least from two people who think the EU system might have been more a nightmare than a dream. Our first panelist is Bruno Amoroso, president of the Federico Cafe Study Center, Roskilde University, and professor at the International University of Hanoi, Vietnam.
Shall I here or there? We stay here, yes. Yes, thank you very much to the center and to Galbraith, of course, for this invitation. It's the first time I am here in Austin, and this is a good way to get in touch more with the American thinking and culture about crisis problems. I should say, first of all, that we should not take so serious, so dramatic as the press usually does, the European leaders meeting. This is a ritual, like the one of the Catholic Church. They meet. They meet is an agenda. They meet to show to themselves that Europe is very democratic, that all leaders count and decide. In fact, most of the decisions that are not taken, they could just as well be taken from home. They could exchange letters. Up to now, and in recent time, to be concrete, in recent time there's been 3 big meetings of the Eurozone and the European Union leaders, and they've been discussing always the same 3 things: the euro crisis, the debt, states debt and bank crisis, and growth. Each time, not much came out of this discussion, and I would say that, funny enough, the crucial problem why these 3 topics, that they are current topics in any country or in any zone, but the most important topic why these 3, they should be discussed in a new light, in a new way. This means the speculation, what has happened, the financial crisis provided by speculative movements from the United States to Europe. This was never discussed. They went on and discusses these 3 topics as if nothing was happened, that the usual, the agenda that, as Galbraith has shown, is, of course, a normal, a permanent agenda of the European countries that reflect what is the dual structure. This is the real problem of the European countries. There is a dual structure between Central, North Europe and Southern Europe. And this produces all the time, of course, difference and tensions. You see, there is something very strange about this crisis. Mario Draghi, that is known because he has become chairman of the European Central Bank, in his last report to the Italian bank, of which he was governor, he said that because of this financial crisis produced by the United States financial problems, Italy lost 5 points of its BNP. To lose 5 points means that if they didn't lose it because of the financial crisis, the economy of Italy would not be extraordinarily well, but would be a normal running economy, of course, with normal structural problems. But then Draghi did not say how to recover these 5 BNP points. They should be, of course, be recovered where they were. This is money that has been stolen. This is the technical economic term, from the pocket of investors and saving people in Italy, and by the way, in other European countries. And this money has not disappeared. This money is in some place. It's in the pocket of speculators, it's in the pocket of banks, it's in the pocket of bank leaders, bonus, and so on and so on. But this was not the topic of Draghi. Draghi said, because we lost 5 points, we have to recover them. How? By changing the pension system. The pension system, of course, should be changed, but there's nothing to do with the financial speculators. We should recover them by improving productivity. Of course, productivity should be improved, but there's nothing to do with the financial. And so on, you can continue. That's why there is a kind of false agenda about these three main topics of the European Union that I will mention very shortly, of course, because of time. First of all, the question of the euro crisis. But we know that in Europe, contrary to what everybody thinks, there is not only the euro. The euro is one of the currency systems that there is in Europe. In Europe, there are at least 12 currency systems, because there are 10 countries that are outside the Eurozone, 2 that do not belong to the European Union, but in fact, they are very much attached to the European Union. This is Norway, Switzerland. And then there is the euro that is the strongest money because it is made by 10 countries. So anyway, we have 12 currencies that are related with a currency system as the one you have any other places in the world. What is the problem? The problem is that 10 countries in the Eurozone, they have a state, their own government, and they have the currency, their own money system. But then we have 17 countries that have a currency, the euro, but they have not government. And the government, by the way, it's made by the central bank. To imagine a state of 10 countries governed by a central bank does not make very much sense, of course. And this is one of the reasons why there is this tension, both within the Eurozone and also between the Eurozone and the other zone. But it's even worse, because you see, not all what happened in the country of the Eurozone has the same value, because if some bonds are issued by the Greek or by the Italian in euro, they have a different value of the bonds issued by the German or the Dutch government. What it makes within the Eurozone, no meaning, because of course the same euro has different value depending from which country is issuing different bonds. So this explains why there is this kind of mess. And then, of course, there is the structural aspect, the dual aspect of the European zone, as I said, because you have a country like Spain with a 22% unemployment, you have a country like Holland and Austria with 2% of unemployment. And this reflects, of course, the dual structure of the European Union, not due only to good or bad governments in different countries, but due to other structural facts. For example, that the euro system is made by the Dutch mark system. It's made for an economy like the German one that is very much export-oriented and very much constraining the internal consumption of the country. While the Southern European countries, they are not so much export-oriented, so that's why the way you utilize the money policy, if it affects the internal market, of course, affects much more their internal system, and so on and so on. The idea of the European countries to divide the debt among countries, what could be done, it has not been done, by the way, but what could be done, it's not very effective, because to divide the debt among all European countries would even push down the growth in the countries that now they have the growth. So this would only spread the problem, not sure to resolve it. The second point is the problem of the Greek crisis and the debt. But you see, on the Greek crisis, something strange has happened, because what it has been decided is that they would reduce the state's debt of 50% by, I think, 2020. Today, the BNP is measured, it's 150. And then they say that 2020 should be 120. But 120 is not 50% of 150. So what is this mystery? You reduce the debt to 50%, but in 2020 it will not be 75%, but it will be instead 120. But this it is because, of course, they reduced the debt, but they increased the rent of the debt, so that, in fact, the Greek will not reduce 50% their debt, but reduce only part of it. And this has been all the way a problem of the Greek crisis. As you know, German banks, French banks utilize for the loans given to the Greek system, they in fact utilize rent that is much over. So the FMI, when they lend money, it's about 3% rent. To the Greek system, a German bank, a French bank, they utilize from 6 to 15% of rent. And this, of course, does not make sense in a normal economic system. And then, in the end, there is the problem of the banks, on which has been decided that they should have 9% of their own capital for their belonging. No European bank, of the big European banks, no one has today 9% of own capital. And this, it has been calculated that 100 banks would go down if this should be realized. So, I mean, they are all decisions that are not really matching with the problem. But then there is the problem, and I finish, of innovation, because also some of the contribution here, they recorded the need of innovation. And for innovation, they made the European Financial Stability Fund, and now they talk about the European Stability Mechanism, and so on and so on. What they are false problem, because the European bank system is made, and this is particular, I think, for Europe, is made of about 30–40% of local banks, like the one you had in the United States before the big concentration and the big crisis. So on these banks, of course, could be built a credit system attached to the real economy, to these enterprises, and so on and so on. But this is not what is done, because Italy, as other European countries, they try to save the big banks. They try to protect them. But the big banks are the ones that are attached to the international financial system, to the American banks and so on, that are the cause of the crisis. So this innovation, they try to support what is the cause of the financial crisis, and not instead to support the credit structure of European countries based on a huge system of small cooperative and not cooperative banks in all territory. But this does not show very much innovative element. It shows that we are going to continue on the same pattern as before. I stop here because the time is gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Terry Gibbons, Associate Professor of Government at the University of Texas.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks to Jamie Galbraith and Doug Bio for having me here today. Just a little bit about my take on the EU more generally. I've done a lot of work on immigration policy in the European Union and far-right parties and anti-immigrant parties, Euroscepticism. And as a political scientist, I have a tendency to focus more on the political aspects of the crisis and not so much the numbers. But going back to the origins of the EU, back after World War, of course, origins go very far back, but certainly after World War II, it seems that if you look at the development of the EU in historical context, there's always been more support for the idea of Europe than the reality. And I think what we're seeing happening right now with Greece and the broader crisis is that people like the idea of Europe, but they don't necessarily like the reality, what it means on the ground, what it means in terms of the loss of sovereignty, and so on. And so, the EU has always been very much a political creature. The rules, regulations, and so on are very important, but as I said, the current events highlight the fact that the players in this drama are first and foremost politicians. And they have to be elected, they have to answer to the public. And I think that, at least from the analysis I have heard, is a lot of the, at least some of the rationale behind Papandreou's actions in the last few days. And we can see that he's in the process, the government's in the process of change. And I have to say, I've been teaching a class on European politics this semester, and it's just been a fascinating way to start off every class with what's the latest in the Euro crisis. It's an incredible teaching moment. But after World War II, Robert Schuman and others led the change to unite Europe. It was clearly a time to end war, to focus on integrating the European economies. And over time, as the development of the EU moved forward, you'd see moments when Europe would push forward, and then moments when there are times when Europe would fall back somewhat. So the 60s were a time period when there was some steady progress towards developing the Union. The 70s saw the enlargement of the EU. But the 80s was a time when Eurosceptics tended to play a larger role. People like Margaret Thatcher, who was very much against the deeper integration of Europe, had a bigger hand in things. But in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, with the unification of Germany, Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand took the opportunity to push forward on deeper integration and were clear leaders in pushing for the new treaties. But because of politics, the Union always seemed to be somewhat incomplete. Well, it's clearly incomplete, because even though politicians knew the need for deeper integration, they were also in some ways afraid of it. There was a lack of the development of enforcement mechanisms and the lack of the development of a fiscal union, and a lot of that, of course, there's a variety of factors, and I couldn't possibly spend the time to go into what led to all of that, but just to touch on it, if you look at many of the aspects of the EU that are so important to its integration, such as the rules around being part of the Eurozone and so on, the lack of enforcement mechanisms has been a major has had a major impact on countries like Greece, and so when you get into the early 2000s and we get into the currency, and countries like Germany and France are some of the first to go over the Eurozone criteria, above the Eurozone criteria without any consequences, then it just makes it that much harder for countries to step in and say to countries like Greece and Italy and so on, you have to rein in your finances. And so one of the things I've really been interested in is this whole idea of leadership. You hear people talking about the democratic deficit in the EU, the fact that people feel that all these decisions are being made up here at the top. And what I see in this situation is that you have these layers in the EU. So right now you have people, the leaders in Europe, Merkel, Sarkozy, and others, making these decisions at these summits here at the top, and then they go home and they have to be at another level where they're dealing with their parliaments, they're dealing with the people. And then you have the whole other layer of kind of the deeper level politics where you have the rise of far-right parties and Eurosceptic parties. And so you have these various layers that interact at different times. And so I think that's why you see some of these disjointed actions happening. Angela Merkel knows she has to be a leader in Europe right now, and so she seems to be, when she's at the summits and so on, she seems to be acting that way, and then she gets back to Germany and she's interacting with her coalition partners and others, and all of a sudden she's making these strange decisions, and everybody's wondering, well, wait a second, she was acting this way at the summit, and yet she gets back to Germany and she's acting in a different way. And so I think it's very important in the context of this crisis to keep in mind that you have all these different factors influencing these very much politicians when they are in these different contexts. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind, I mean, I look at Sarkozy, who's in the middle of a presidential campaign. He takes the lead on Libya because he knows that will be important for his standing in France. And yet he's very weak when it comes to being able to negotiate at these summits because his own country is having its own set of issues with the banking sector and so on. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that Euroscepticism is very much alive in Europe these days. We've seen it in the rise of parties like Geert Wilders' Freedom Party in the Netherlands. In the last European Parliament elections, you had parties that had never been in the European Parliament before get in, who are Eurosceptic parties like the United Kingdom Independence Party and various other parties that have come on the scene more recently. So I haven't seen a lot of public opinion polls lately, but I'm sure there is a strong undercurrent of Euroscepticism going on right now in Europe. And I think that as we talk about the various political or economic factors, and I think Jamie alluded to this in his opening remarks, is that part of the lack of will is coming out of the political situation in Europe. And the political situation in Europe is very much in flux. Spain is having elections very soon, and so on. So I think we have to keep in mind that there's a political cycle going on here, and that is having a very big impact and may even be one of the driving forces behind the economic crisis. So I think that's enough for now, and I will pass it on to my next colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. The next speaker is Helen Parkas. He's Emeritus Professor of Economics, University of Franche-Comté, Besançon, France.
Thank you very much. I entirely agree with my colleague Terry Gibbons. What happened now in Europe is a dream turned into a nightmare. And it is not an economic crisis, it is a pure political crisis and the outcome of what should be deemed Euro economics, which explain why even the proposals of Varoufakis, on which I entirely agree, are pure horror for our leadership in Germany, but especially in France. First, there is a question that should be asked. In 1908, the chair of the French then Société Générale wrote, "The safest assets for a good banker are the public debt." At that time, 2/3 of the assets of the French banks were debts from Russia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. 90% of the Russian Tsarist budget was financed by bonds sold to the French banks. Never the least crisis. So, how could we explain that the European economy is collapsing? And when we say that the Greek government lied about statistics, what could be said about the French government? Everybody knows that all data provided by the French authorities are pure lies. I tried to compute, which is extremely difficult, what is really going on in the French economy, it's an absolute disaster. Effective rate unemployment around 50 or 60%, total collapse of the share of wages, inflation, poverty, and their likes. It explains why our next president could be the leader of a neo-Nazi party, Marine Le Pen. So what happened? What happened was the fact that not the European Union, but the European Monetary Union was created mainly under the sponsorship of François Mitterrand and his advisors, Attali, Aglietta, Robert Boyer, and their likes. What they had in mind was a total privatization of the state, dismantling the state so as to get rid forever of social expenditures, culture expenditures, and their likes. Which means that the state had to be treated as a pure corporation and a non-useful corporations. So, when they created an independent central bank, what they had in mind was the hope that since the state would be obliged to get finance by private banks, banks would impose harsh constraints on the state. So there would be an automatic decrease on state expenditures. And indeed, at the same time, they pursued harsh, permanent deflation, at least since 1983, with Mitterrand austerity policy, which has, as I proved in many writings, a pure decision, an independent decision of the French government. So what happened? Indeed, deficits, because of deflation, of the collapse of the European real economy. Indeed, public debt. So, banks had to accumulate private debt, the counterpart of them being purely unproductive deficits. The outcome should have been expected. What maintained the value of those bonds was no more the state. The European Central Bank, which I would support, had not the least impact on bonds and their value. Contrary to what many people believe, it is not the central bank, not the European Commission who are guilty, but the European governments, the German and mainly the French. Thereby, as soon as happened the financial crisis in the US, banks' expectations collapsed. And since debt issued by states were a pure private assets, only depending on the goodwill of rating agencies, obviously, collapse of the value. What was the reply of all governments especially the French government. Deflation, 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 and deflation. The same Sarkozy, who is speaking on helping the poor, recently imposed by some kind of decree the harshest austerity plan ever implemented in civilized countries. All public expenditures have been cut by 10%. And why? To repay the debt, and to repay the debt, of course, the outcome is more deflation, and to add, if I dare say, folly to bad economics, instead of promoting the very wise and audacious proposals, if I dare say, of Professor Yannakis, the same President Sarkozy went to China begging money to ask the Chinese to invest money into the European monetary system. Indeed, the confidence of banks only could collapse. But what is behind this kind of Euronomics, mainly Frenchonomics, not neoclassical economics? The high technocrats in the French government and the Europe and completely ignore everything in economics. Some kind of very crude, pseudo-Ricardian, agrarian economics and very crude and naive Marxian economics. As Attali, the de facto prime minister for many years, what we need is to create the strongest capitalist system in the world by imposing a culture of deflation, poverty, decrease of consumption. Thereby, I do think that the Greeks were scapegoats. What they have in mind, and it is explicitly stated into a memo of the French Ministry of Finance, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Portuguese should send all public assets to banks. And thereby, as such, I think the crisis is to increase, and if there is no change, it would collapse. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next and last panelist is Matias Vernengo. He was described as a Brazilian, but I understand he was born in Argentina, lived in Brazil, and for the last 8 years has been Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Utah.
I'm going to use the PowerPoint, so let me just a second. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I should say, you know, first of all, that I as was just said, I actually, you know, was born in Argentina. My family moved to Brazil when in the 70s when I was a kid. So I grew up in Brazil, and I'm very much Brazilian. I thought, in fact, for a while, you know, that's the reason why Jamie invited me. Between Argentina and Brazil, we have defaulted around 8 times, I think, historically. So we could give some advice to, Yanis on what to do. I myself been bankrupted 3 times. That's why I'm leaving the U.S. now. And I don't know if you heard about, the consumer credit, problems. Some say it's the Argentinian immigration. But at any rate, I think it's several things that I want to say. This is a slightly different presentation than what you the title, which is Dream or Nightmare, I should say, and it's more a presentation of the causes of the crisis, and as such, I should say. I quite didn't think of the question of dream or nightmare, but I think Gary's right that I'm going to say also that it's kind of a nightmare. But I think that it should be costed in the following sense: nightmare for whom? So the question is not generic. It's dream or nightmare. So who are the winners and the losers in this particular project? So the European Union has been a project. And so there are winners and losers in this particular project. And very recently, this week I think, it came out in the New Yorker column by Cassidy it was titled "The Man Who Saw Through the Euro." And that man was Wynne Godley. So I worked for Wynne Godley back at the Levy Institute in the 90s. And this quotes a paper from 1992 in which Wynne says fundamentally that there is a core economic problem. So I would agree with both Terry and Alain that this is a political crisis, but there is a core economic problem that the politics is unable to solve. And so there is an economic problem in that design. What Wynne suggested at that time was that on the one hand there is no mechanism to solve imbalances within the European Union, and also in particular the lack of those mechanisms were related to fiscal instruments to deal with imbalances, given that once you have a monetary union you cannot deal with exchange rate variation. So I'm going to jump and skip so the four things I said there that I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of financial regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit of the consequence and give some policy conclusions. So I'm jumping here the model a little bit. The model fundamentally says something about the crisis. So fundamentally what you have is that the boom was to a great extent associated to big transfers of funds, if you want, investment from the central countries to peripheral countries or non-core countries in the Union. That was helped by financial deregulation. Wages in the periphery of Europe grew significantly in comparison to what happened in the core countries. So fundamentally in Germany and France, wages have been stagnant. I should say Alain seems to blame more the French than the Germans, and I was thinking to myself, he's trying to convince an American. I know, but in his case it's interesting because he's trying to convince an American audience that they should blame the French, which should be an easy sell here. So, Liberty fries or whatever it is that we eat now here. So, so obviously that generated what? Appreciation of the exchange rate in real terms in the periphery countries, and that led to the imbalances. So I'm going to jump to actually the data here and show you in reverse of what I have here. So these are unit labor costs in Germany and some of the and I mean the main periphery countries that are in trouble. And you see Germany is the one down there. So you see that unit labor costs went really up in the other countries. So this is a real appreciation of the exchange rate in those countries. This leads to current account problems, significant current account problems. You see the imbalances here. So Germany, that at the beginning of the euro in '99, it's more or less balanced, gets a big surplus, is the one on top. All the others move into significant deficits. The only one that you can say had a, sort of already a deficit in this case was Portugal, in fact. So it's not the case of Greece. Here you see the fiscal deficits. The Greek deficits might be slightly bigger depending on what measures you use. This is from Eurostat, I should say, so it's the official data. And you see clearly that the deficits occur only, they get really out of line and increase with the crisis. So first thing I want to, it's important to say, this is not a fiscal crisis in any sense. So it's the same if you look at debt to GDP ratios. You see they only go up with the crisis. They're always going down before the crisis. So it's not a fiscal crisis. It's not a fiscal problem. The fiscal problem is that it's enabled, the fiscal mechanisms that the union has are not there to solve, these imbalances. So the countries that have, current account deficits somehow have to finance that, and the obvious thing, what they've been doing is, printing debt, and and that was sustainable provided the ECB decided to do so. So. The second point I want to make, coming then from Argentina and Brazil, is that this is very different from the Argentinian and crisis. So there is a regular thing in the literature that if you academic papers on the newspapers suggest that the Argentinian case is a good example of how you can solve this. And so let me point out some important distinctions between the Argentinian crisis and the European situation. The Argentinian economy had tied its exchange rate constitutionally, to the dollar. But the Argentinian debt and the current account deficits were fundamentally in dollars, a currency that Argentina does not print. So the debt was foreign debt. In the European case, it's slightly different because there are European institutions, there are no European bonds, but all the bonds are denominated in euros. And the ECB has an ability to print euros, and they can buy euros. In fact, when you look at the size of the Greek debt, which is slightly more than $500 billion, so 380-something euros, that corresponds more or less to 3% of the Euro 17 GDP, which is tiny. It's a very small amount of debt. The Argentinian debt to exports, because Argentinians cannot print dollars, so the relevant denominator for the debt is the exports, was more than 300%. So the Argentinian debt, somebody says, oh, the Greek debt is bigger than the Argentinian. Yeah, they're measuring in amount of dollars. Who cares? The Argentinian debt was huge, given its ability to pay. The Greek debt, given the ability of the Europeans to pay, is tiny. The ECB doesn't need to buy 387 billion euros in debt. If they buy 50 billion, markets calm down. They have done so with Italian and Spanish debt. So the peculiarity of the crisis is that it's political because there has an economic basis, an imbalance that it's unable to solve, but that technically is simple to solve. So that's the peculiarity of this crisis. The second thing that differentiates this from the Argentinian story is that default in Argentina led to an incredible recovery. So Argentina grew, in the 8 years that followed the 2002 crisis, at an average rate of that's a strange Freudian slip, rage. At around 8%, 8.5% or so. But the thing is that Argentina grew at the same time that it was exporting fundamentally commodities and mainly soybeans to China. And China was growing, as you know, at 10%. And so that obviously implies that Argentina tied its recovery to the booming Chinese economy. The Greek case is very different because if Greeks go back to the drachma, and they devalue significantly their currencies, they will still be exporting fundamentally tourism to Germans, which have not been growing that much. So there is another problem here. The model here, trying to get to the question of dream or nightmare, is that there was a project. It's not very different from the project we had in the US, that started with Reagan, in the sense that, they have deregulation, as you see here, the years. So in the 80s, and 90s, you have significant deregulation. This deregulation led to, here you have an index. So, I don't necessarily believe in everything that indexes say, but, what this suggests is done by Manzi Chin. and suggests that core countries and non-core countries converge pretty fast as complete the regulation of their financial systems. You see that other euro countries and non-euro countries, non-euro there being Sweden and United Kingdom, did not converge. So they're very open financially, but they didn't completely converge in terms of financial liberalization with the other European countries, which allowed a significant accumulation of that. So you have some cases in which clearly you have speculative bubbles, even in housing, like in Ireland and Spain. So very similar to the American story. And you see this with the convergence of interest rates here. So interest rates in the non-core countries converge completely to the core countries. So credit is very cheap and accessible in those countries. So there is an expansion. At the beginning, wages were not growing, I should say. So wages will grow later in these countries. It's an effect of this financial liberalization that allows lots of that to go on and so on and so forth. It's not a brutal increase in wages, so it's not that the labor force in Spain is doing fantastically. So a lot of the boom in Spain was associated, for example, to consumption debt, so not very different from the American story. And you have this story that I already told you. So what you have there, at the core of this is what I here followed, oh, good Lord, Cesarato, and called this, no, it has to go up this way. It's here in the conclusions, so bear with me. German mercantilism, so I beat Heiner on this one. So the core of this model, if there is an economic problem, which I think there is, so it's a political crisis, but caused with an economic core problem, which is German wages do not grow. And Germany grows on the basis of, so the low unemployment levels in Germany depend a lot on exports. And that model cannot be exported to the periphery of Europe. So the periphery of Europe cannot also hold wages down and export. So, it's a zero-sum game. So that's the problem, the economic problem at the core of the European Union. I would certainly agree, and I had not time to read it carefully, Yanni's proposal, that what it's needed, it's, first of all, Eurobonds and a sort of a New Deal and fiscal expansion in Europe. But I'm very pessimistic that that sort of solution will actually take place. Reason being that there are winners in this actual system. So as much as the debt crisis of Latin America in the 80s implied that for almost 20 years, Latin American countries were forced to generate export surpluses that fundamentally went to pay interest to American banks. And that system did work for Latin American elites, it did work for American banks and, if you want, corporations, but it didn't help workers in Latin America. It didn't help workers in the US. So that's the part, it's at that point, with the debt crisis in Latin America, that they sell the whole notion of liberalization, so that they put Mexican workers to compete with American workers. What people forget is that, yes, American workers in Detroit have lost, but so have, Mexican workers. And that's the same here. So who wins? It's political, elites, economic elites in the periphery, that can, save their money and put it away and so on and so forth. It's certainly, corporations in Germany, in France, that are, winning with this. But it's not certainly the workers in the periphery, but also not the workers in Germany, because the high rates of unemployment in the periphery that Jamie showed, even though you don't have high levels of unemployment in the center, in the core countries of Europe, implies that they cannot expand their wages. So it's a way of keeping workers in the core countries in line. So, I'm, regarding this question, dream or nightmare, I was thinking, it seems that you need almost like a hero to come and solve the problems of Europe. I'm not in favor of, Carlyle's notion that, of heroes in history. So I was, educated to believe in, deep economic structures are the things that matter to explain, the evolution of political, developments. But I would suggest that, the only thing I could envision is somebody that, some sort of political leadership that comes from outside and enforces a kind of solution. And that reminded me of what Bertolt Brecht said about, heroes. Pity the country that needs heroes. Thank you.
Well, I wasn't being very draconian, but our panelists stuck very closely to their time limits and leaves us a good time for questions from the audience. I'd like to suggest that we begin with the participants and see if they have questions, and then after about 15 minutes we'll open it to the general audience. And could I ask if you have a question that there's a runner with a mic that will come to you, and if you would identify yourself, please, and direct the question at individual panelists or to the panelists as a whole. Question down here.
Hello again. I've spoken, but I'd like to address some issues. Especially, I'd like to take on Professor Gibbons' assertion that that there is the idea for European integration and not reality of the European, integration. Well, I don't agree. I can vividly remember the 80s in Poland. All gloom and despair, the country bankrupt, infrastructure in ruins. I mean, no perspective and future. So then when the communist, country trapped behind the Iron Curtain, then when communists collapsed, we knew that we would like to join the European community at that time, now European Union, because that was sort of the best prospect for modernization and prosperity. And this is actually what happened. I mean, not only on the economic front, but also in other very important issues. Like, I can travel from Warsaw to Lisbon, like you can travel from Texas to New Mexico. I don't have to have a passport or something. So there is a great deal of benefits of the European integration. The problem is that the Europeans tend to take them all for granted. I mean, they don't, think about them because it has, they have become the part of their everyday experience. So I would say that it is very much about reality. Then ideas might not be sort of up to the reality sometimes. And in terms of the support and public support, well, it's true that there are some, not so positive statistics, but in Poland, 80% of the population is for the European integration. No political party that plays on anti-European sentiments has a slight chance of winning. So I think that if we could broaden the perspective of this analysis and bring into the picture the countries that came into the European Union, like Poland and others. So I would say that we would have a much more optimistic picture. Thank you very much.
Yes, I mean, to address you, I have actually this sort of schizophrenic personality to bring into this game, because on the one hand, as an academic, living in Europe, living in the United States, I see Europe as a project that only works in advances through crises. And so maybe the question of whether it's a dream or a nightmare needs a better dialectical positioning, because we're moving from one chapter to another only through crisis. The question here is whether this crisis is unfortunately one that may get out of control to destroy the whole project. That's the first question, and I would like the panelists to address that question. But we can go back, and Terry implied that there are these leaps and then there are these sideways spirals of crisis that necessitate the next leap. And it's not clear today to what extent this project can leap forward and how it would leap forward. But I will also want to say that my own personal history makes this a very different question, because I'm originally Hungarian and I grew up in Austria, so I lived on both sides of the Iron Curtain. after 1956, and I'm also the child of Holocaust survivors. And in that sense, having European integration is a necessity because it's the only way to have conflict resolution without warfare. Unfortunately, Europe is an extremely war-prone history, and now we don't have that. We have sort of stylized conflicts, and the stylized conflicts should not be confused with politicians and political crisis. It is, as Bruno said at the very beginning, there's a kabuki theater aspect to it, but there is a necessity to resolve conflicts. And the depth of the conflicts are not imaginable for Americans. Because, for example, if you live in Austria, you have 9 different dialects, and the dialects are cultural expressions of people who don't trust each other, where the next valley is already a different country. So you have on the ground an incredibly deep cultural kind of obsession with itself and themselves that is difficult to overcome. And so to have this superstructure built on Europe is probably a necessity to just keep the place hanging together.
Thank you. I think it'd be good to collect maybe a few questions before we have people respond. And there's a gentleman here had his hand up in the red jacket.
Thank you very much. I'm Kunibert Raffe, University of Vienna, from another valley. I agree with a lot of what has been said, and I am also convinced that it's not so much an economic crisis in spite of the economic basis, but it's a political crisis, or it's strongly exaggerated by bad troubleshooting, trouble enlarging rather than troubleshooting. And I also agree to what Professor Amoroso said about Mr. Draghi, that the solutions are wrong solutions. And I think one could formulate it in the following way, that it's the spectacle of a neoliberal crisis, a big neoliberal crisis, being used to enforce and strengthen neoliberal policy, instead of the normal consequence of abolishing and reforming it. And this as such is something very unhealthy. There is one point where I have some slight disagreement or say question. And Professor Amoroso said the difference in Eurobonds, the interest rates in Eurobonds, show that there are different euros in different countries. I don't see this in the same way. Because I understand in this country, the US, to the best of my knowledge, is one country. California pays a different rate of interest for their instruments, if they can issue any, than, say, whatever, the city of New York or the state of New York. And still, that is the dollar, I think, is the same US dollar. And I don't see why it should be different in Europe. Thank you.
Could I ask the panelists if they'd like to respond to do so?
Yes, I would like to respond first to the question dream or nightmare, because I think the idea of this title was referring to the European Union was thought, this just after the Second World War, was thought with a great idea, was a great experiment in Europe, despite the diversity of European countries, and even because of the diversity of European countries, to create a system of cooperation among states. The big push was because of the wars, so this could create a system of cooperation, of living together, in which it was very synergical about market, resources, material, and so on. This was the great dream of the European Union, to experiment a new system of living together without the level of homogenization you had, for example, United States for historical reasons, but keeping in Europe the diversity, but living together in harmonical and cooperative way. But then what happened? Why this dream broke down? First, because came the Cold War. The division between East and West in Europe was not created by God, was created because of the Cold War. That's why the Polish could not travel around in the West, but also in the West we could not travel everywhere. From Italy to go to Denmark, there were many barriers and many difficulties, but that was the Cold War that created both in the East and in the West this division and this situation of economic depression. And then in the 89, we had again the chance of the dream, because in the 89, the possibility to unificate Europe in cooperation, not in competition, in peace and not in war was a great chance for the European area to come together. But this was broken by globalization since the 70s, that in the 80s started to work. So the neoliberal sort of globalization broke down the possibility of European countries to create a synergical, cooperative way of living together, a great social experiment. And instead it became, again, competitiveness among the Germans and the Greek and the Italian and so on and so on. All what has been created of institutional frames, like the Central European banks, they become a straitjacket for these countries to be free and to transform something different. It is true that Poland today is better off than it was before, but also Italy after '89 was better off than it was before. So that's not very different. The problem is that in the future, Poland will become like Italy, with the north and the south, unless we do together something different. Because as you know, in Poland, you have the eastern Poland that more and more is resembling the Mezzogiorno in Italy. That's why we talk about the European Mezzogiornos, eastern Poland, southern Italy, and by the way, also eastern Germany, but that's another matter. So that's why the problem is to watch forward and to see what are the factors that today make impossible this kind of coherent transformation. The reasons we haven't discussed, maybe will come later, but the problem today of the new financial power that dominate both the USA economies, but also the European economy, what we call in general speculators, but they are not speculators. This is a new power at the world level that is controlling both your Federal Reserve, but also the European Central Bank. The people are the same. They are called Goldman Sachs. Mario Draghi is Goldman Sachs, as your Federal Reserve has always been dominated by this interest. But that's another matter.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree with what the Deputy Chief of Mission said. Certainly, Eastern European countries are many of them are very positive towards Europe and so on. It's very hard in a short analysis to talk about all 27 countries, and even within countries, there are some regions that are more pro-Europe, others that are not. And I think it's interesting, though, if you look at in the broader context of history and so on, and even more recently in Germany, I mean, obviously you've had crises and over time and different situations. But in Germany, when they switched to the euro, there was a lot of resistance to giving up the Deutschmark, but Germany was one of the main winners from this whole process. Germany's, if we were back with the Deutschmark and the Lira and the Drachma, Germany's, the Deutschmark would be, I mean, the exchange rate would just be hugely impeding German exports right now. So I think we have to keep in mind that there's just a lot of different factors that are, it's a very complex situation, and it's hard to brush broad strokes over it, but in any case, yeah, I agree that Poland is certainly one of the winners out of this whole process.
Well, I also agree with my colleagues, but first I would say it will be maybe the last chance to save Europe if countries like Poland entered the European Union. They could act as some kind of learning and progressive force against the dark forces in France and Germany. Second point, since the start, all kind of political integration, federalist integration, had been rejected. There were, in Italy especially, from the left, some supporting some kind of United States of Europe. But it was explicitly rejected, not by the Germans, but by the French government since General de Gaulle and François Mitterrand and Sarkozy. Third point, there is no political integration, but since the European Monetary Union, there has been an increasing private integration. There is an emerging integration of core capitalism in Europe, especially French corporations and banks are large shareholders of German corporations and vice versa. And the capitalist ruling class or elite in Europe, at least in France and Germany, obviously shares the same agenda. And the problem is that they completely control, without any kind of opposition, what is going on in the political sphere. At least there are debates in Germany. There is a strong left-wing party in Germany, the so-called Linke Partei. But not the least debate is accepted and authorized in France. Such a conference could never happen in France, which it is quite a state ruling ideology, not the least discussion on economic policy. As for the Eurobonds, yes, there could be a solution, but as long as they are issued by some kind of federal institution, like some kind of democratic European Monetary Fund acquired by the European Central Bank. And indeed, the European Central Bank, I would support it. It only meets what has been imposed on it by governments and by France and Germany. If France and Germany really wished to save the system, they could. If they wished to accept the modest proposals, they will be accepted. The problem is that nobody in Germany, and that I am sure nobody in France, is ready to accept such a solution. And I was delighted to hear that the Polish are enlightened people, which everybody knows for a very long time. But the problem, as I told you, is that according to non-published polls, because the government never dares to publish those polls, at least 3/4 of the French population are now against the euro. Why? Not because of the euro itself, but because the regime is unceasingly using the euro to impose policies completely achieving the destruction of the French economy and society, which means that as I told you, the sole party in France which seems against austerity policy is the same which is against the euro, and it is the neo-Nazi party. And this is a shame for France, I must confess. I would prefer to be Polish now
Oh, we can
than
give you,
French.
I mean, we can talk about that later. Yeah. We can do that.
Matthias, do you have?
I have two brief replies to comments on Professors Robert Goodman and Kunifer Raffer's comments. I think it's a great sort of addition to the discussion. The notion that there is a dialectical process of crisis solution. But you referred to two things that I'm not quite sure I would put it in the same way. First of all, if there is a dialectical process, you have to admit then that there is no single European project. There has been several European projects. The original European project had to do a lot with what you referred, which is also associated to your, personal history. So the question of, the war and the Holocaust and all of those things and how you deal with the German problem. I don't think that that's the problem we're dealing with right now in Europe. I think that the European problem has been for a long while something associated, what I tried to suggest is the same problem that we have had in the US. It's the question of financial globalization. It's the process of this resurgence of something that the Great Depression had sort of eliminated. That's why Yanis is talking about a New Deal, because that's what we need. So the question, even if you talk about the political question in Europe, is a question: what do Europe, people want? Do they want a Europe which will be multicultural, that will include, the Islamic immigrants and so on and so forth, or a Europe that does not want those things? And so a lot of the austerity and the project of, limitation of the ability of having a welfare state, that it's encompassive and generous with the periphery of Europe, has to do with this sort of project that it's financial, pro-corporations, and limits the ability. So in that sense, I think you're right, but, it seems incredibly complicated, not just in Europe, in the US, to sort out that particular project. So always that I go to Mexico, they ask me, so how do we solve this? I don't know. How do you get out of NAFTA? It's a difficult thing to do. Mexican workers lose, American workers lose. It's not a very inclusive project. It has generated terrible dynamics in both regions. So I think it's an important thing you said. I reminded, I said something about Win Godley. I wanted to say something else about Win, in that respect. Win once told me at that time, because the euro was really a terrible thing, and I have read at that time even Alain was against the euro, thought that monetary union would be a bad thing. So before it was done, Alain was against it. And I remember Win telling me, you don't want to be with the people that are against Europe. So I'm all for the European project, but that's, you see, it's what I think of Europe. It's not necessarily what Angela Merkel thinks of Europe, and so that's a problem. With respect to Professor Raffer's comment, I think it's not equivalent to say California and different European countries. That's again a story. Argentina and California are very often used as examples of this stuff. And here's the thing that makes it different. Yes, California pays different interest rates than say Utah or Connecticut, but there is a national public debt. Yeah. And that first of all, there is more mobility of labor between workers in one place and the other. Second of all, that if Bank of America goes bankrupt, the Fed will sort of enter and save the Bank of America. California is not going to go completely bankrupt. That's not the case in Greece. With the size of that it's considerably smaller than anything that California has. So the existence of national institutions makes a difference. In that respect, talking about the New Deal, Jamie had a whole thing on the crisis, that suggested exactly that part of what the Great Depression did is that it finally brought back the South. It unified the South, so to speak, and allowed it to converge to American standards because of fiscal transfers and whatnot. The fiscal transfers in Europe, the economists had a thing on the fiscal transfers in Europe and in the U.S. The fiscal transfers in the U.S. are huge in comparison to the fiscal transfers in Europe, and so that's a significant difference that makes the situation of California not equivalent to the situation of Greece or other peripheral countries. But we probably do agree that there is a rational solution for this, and that the rational solution would be national Eurobonds, or that would be one of the things that would be involved in that solution.
Thank you. I think given the time, we can open it up to the general audience. I think you had someone with his hand up before we... I'm blinded by the light, so I can't really see you. Go ahead.
My name is it on? Yeah. My name is Gilles Raveau. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the University of Paris Saint-Denis. And I have a quick question for Matthias in particular, but also for the others. Matthias, you said that a huge difference between Greece and Argentina is that Argentina was borrowing in a foreign currency, which Greece is not. And it's a bit of a provocation, but also a serious question. Isn't, on the contrary, the very core of the problem the fact that Greece is in some way also borrowing in a foreign currency?
Oh, yeah. The key question here is in some way. So Argentina, if they had to, solve the crisis, there is no ready-made, you know what sparked the crisis in December 2001? There is a loan that Argentina has to pay $3 billion to the IMF. And it's receiving a loan from the IMF. The IMF basically does this, takes $3 billion from one account, moves it to another account. With that, Argentina complied with the payment of its foreign obligations. It's just a transfer in DC. Argentina never saw that $3 billion. At that point, the IMF said, no, we don't transfer the account from here to here. There is a run on Argentinian banks. The IMF's ability to create dollars, limited. The IMF is not a central bank of the world. So Argentina has a debt in American dollars. Was even talked in the American Treasury to give money to Argentina? Not at all. The Treasury did give to Mexico in '95. That rescue was through the American Treasury, because Mexico is really close, and there are lots of Mexicans coming into the country, so that tends to be a problem. We are too far away down in Argentina. Greece actually is, connected to an institution in which they do have a vote. Not dominant, but still have a vote, which brings the very amount, the very currency in which they have their debt. So it's, although you're right that if you don't control it, it's in some way similar, this is irrational in a way in which the Argentinian story wasn't. Again, look at the size. People say, oh, it's the same size. Argentina has to export to get dollars. That's true in the short run, in the long, it doesn't matter. Argentina cannot get dollars unless it does this, because the US is not going to print dollars for Argentina. Hence, the debt to GDP to exports ratio is more than 300%. The debt to European GDP of Greece is 3%. We're talking of a tiny thing. The ECB can do this by buying, $50 billion of 50 billion, could be in dollars even, which is less, $50 billion of Greek debt. So it's pretty rational. So that says that politically, what's behind this is that they want to maintain the line on, you're going to do the austerity, because the project of Europe is a project in which they want austerity. So it is a project that it is by definition nightmare for the working class of Europe.
Absolutely.
And it was at the beginning. That's the question. So it's a dream for whom? Oh, yeah, if you live in Les Champs-Élysées.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Bravo.
For him, it's not. No. So for some people, it's
just a point.
A good thing.
The Greek state has no vote in Frankfurt. The independent central bank of Greece has a vote, but the Greek government has not the least vote in the European Central Bank.
Jeremy Suri.
Hi, I want to first thank the panelists for a wonderful set of discussions. I'm Jeremy Suri. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School. And I want to put on the table the question about the social welfare state. I mean, one of the things that has not been discussed on this panel is the degree to which the social welfare state poses problems in the European system, as the panel leads it. And I just want to put the three standard arguments on the table and hear your responses. One, there's an unsustainable lifestyle, a set of life expectations, at least for certain parts of Europe, that are out of whack with production scales, putting the argument on the table. Second, that there's a presumption within the European system that the rich states will pay a transfer into the poorer states. That's been a problem historically for the United States as well, and Jamie's right, the New Deal reformulated that equation within the United States, but it wasn't easy. It took many generations after Abraham Lincoln for that to happen. And then the third question, to what extent is the entire European system also based upon the presumption that other externalities will be paid for by others, in particular security costs? And to what extent will potentially rising security costs also create a problem here? One of the ghosts in the room, as someone who studies security issues, is the degree to which the United States is going to be significantly reducing its security umbrella at a very time when one might consider a new set of security issues, maybe non-traditional ones, but security issues nonetheless that Europeans will have to deal with. So those three issues, I'd just love to hear your reflections on them.
No, you know, the history of the European Union, it's made different, because when it was made, the basic idea was we make a common market. It started from there. It's very rational, because if you have a common market, you don't discuss where to place investment, for example. You place them where they give the biggest output. Because, of course, if in any place of Europe we get bigger of output, then all the European people can share. This was made for the agriculture policy. You know, in 10 years, by the European agriculture policy, inspired by this liberal idea, all the southern European agriculture that was there, the European agriculture, moved to the north. Belgium today, for many years, has been the biggest exporter of tomato of Europe. Tomato, they were made in Sicily, in Europe. By the way, with environment and energy cost much lower, also the quality was better. But the general idea that you should invest where the output of capital was better. Agriculture moved to the north. Then came the industrial policy of the European Union. All industrial policy moved industry from south also, where there were many industries. They moved all to the core of Europe. Then the financial system moved to Frankfurt and to London. Finally, in the last 10 years, the famous Society of Knowledge, the Society of Knowledge moved all the best cultural institutions to the center of Europe. The ideology was this: we get richer by this system, this rational capitalist system, and then, of course, the output will be for everybody. But this has been cheating the European people. And today, so unless you reverse the process, you rebring agriculture there where it's rational, by the way, to put agriculture in terms of quality, environment, energy, unless you dislocate the industrial internal manufacture production of Europe, where it's more important to serve territories and local needs, unless you redislocate culture because it's diversified. Otherwise, we don't sort out of this problem. So that's why there is a kind of hypocrisy by the Germans or anybody to say, but this is ours. This is not yours. This is the process of accumulation of low European people during 50 years after the war. And that's the trick. I mean, no? Then on this now, you have even a financial system that don't recognize anything, but just want to take the saving of the people everywhere. And that's, of course, bring conflict. That's why the European Union, from a peaceful, cooperative, synergical system, is going to be a conflict system, even in terms of wars, because Europe was not made for war. Don't forget it, Polish colleagues. today Europe is exporting wars, but not because of ideology, because they go to take the oil in the Arab country, and the oil in our country they take not only from Gaddafi, they take it from Italy, because this is an internal European war, what is going on in the Arab world today. And that is a serious problem if we really like to think about a European project.
Thank you. Brief responses from other panelists?
Yeah, just a very brief first response. You spoke of externality. Finally, I think that the key problem now in Europe is that it is no more any kind of economic logic, pure ideology, quite culture, and if not a religion of austerity. And for those people to renounce austerity, to adopt Professor Varoufakis' proposals would be as if the Pope decreed in Rome that God doesn't exist.
Just very briefly to your, you have 3 points, all well taken and important. I'll limit myself to the first one, which I can say something intelligent. I think you're talking about a general argument for, the crisis of the state. And so, the welfare state is too big, is increasing since, O'Connor in the 70s, even the left has admitted that it seems to be that problem. I have a certain belief that this is manufactured to a great extent. It's not necessary. It's true that there are problems with the welfare state, but those are mostly manufactured. So higher rates of interest have implied that the burden of debt has increased. So you can check that even in the American accounts, we spend more on interest payments than we used to. That implies less space for other kinds of spending. Also, it's how you tax people. So taxation burdens, and that obviously has something to do with not having a common tax structure around Europe, and then and that sort of thing. But here I want to add one thing that seems to be missed, in this whole discussion. You have to be careful, when you talk about this. It was to begin with a very uneven welfare state in Europe, and so it's not all the same in all parts. And and in that respect, I want to emphasize that it's not necessarily because it seems to come once in a while. It's like the Germans are winning. It's German businesses, and financial system is winning, but not necessarily German workers. They have given up lots of their, previous welfare. They're retiring later, their wages don't go up, and so on and so forth. So this is, in general, part of the problem with the project. It's a project that it's against the working class and against the welfare state. So when originally the European project wasn't about that. So this has been hijacked by financial interests. And that's an important part of this, I think, of the discussion of the welfare state, which puts it in the same place with the whole discussion of globalization and the welfare state, not just in Europe, but in the US and other parts of the world.
And you're right. Last point: the welfare state in Europe is now dying. It's clear that Sarkozy policy is obviously the death of what was once the French welfare state.
And keep in mind, inequality is also...
Yes, inequality is rising the stars, of course.
I think we have time for one more question. This gentleman in the front.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Norman Birnbaum. I find it very interesting that I listened very carefully, but nobody on this great and highly instructive panel mentioned the nation in which these processes of destruction of the welfare state, financialization of public life went furthest, namely, and in which, by the way, at the same time, Euroscepticism is most profound, namely Great Britain. It's true. It's almost as if, as you know, the British, despite the geographic, what appears to be an uncontested geographic fact that it's about 20 kilometers or 20 miles from France, really believe that they're located someplace around Iceland and act that way in the international sphere, a national obsession which appears uncurable. But the fact is, if you look at the structures of British politics, the self-destruction of the British Labour Party, in which socialism is now a matter for its historians rather than for political practice, the internal divisions in what used to be called conservatism, one finds all of these processes advanced while Mr. Cameron declares that the pretends to give lessons to the Eurozone. And so that I really would appreciate some remarks on how Britain fits into this picture. It's still not an inconsiderable nation in many, many ways. Secondly, I just can't help remarking the discussion on the Mezzogiorno, or the spreading of the Mezzogiorno-like phenomena, Eastern Europe or Western Europe, makes one as an American think again of the uniqueness and idiosyncrasy of our system. You can always find the Mezzogiorno in America around the corner.
Thank you. I was going to count that as a comment, but you did pose a question, and we have maybe just a minute or two if someone on the panel would like to respond.
You. Yes, I can. Yes, it's of course it's not a small question what you put, because in a kind way you are questioning the framework of the analysis. Of course, the question of Great Britain has one short answer, one more complicated. The short answer is that there is a specificity about Great Britain, that they never accept to be in Europe, but they still think to be in United States. And this influences also the way Great Britain is related to the European Union. It is true that in their social system they are more European than American in some way. But it is also true that politically speaking, there is the problem of belonging of Great Britain, and it's a geopolitical problem. The second, more specific one is that Great Britain specializes itself in Europe in the financial system. And that's why the way they are destabilizing also the British welfare system and so on has something to do with it, because Britain is one of the channel through which the financial system, both the United States, but also the international financial system, is today entering and attacking Europe. But these are two questions to be a little bit more elaborated. Now, about the Mezzogiorno, I don't know, maybe there is also a tendency to see small corner everywhere. But the problem is that, you know, through 150 years of Italian unification, after 50 years European Union, the Mezzogiorno of Italy still remains a problem, not only for Italy, but for Europe. But now what we are seeing, that this is not due because the Italians are strange, the Italian in the southern Italy, because the same mechanism is going to be reproduced in Poland and in Eastern Germany. Why? Because both Eastern Poland and Eastern Germany, they are country inside the country. Eastern Germany had a different culture than the rest of Germany, and this is reappearing strongly, but as a problem for the integration. And the same is for Eastern Poland. So there are studies about it that try to touch this problem.
I think on that point we'll have to draw this to a close so that we have time for a short break before the next panel. I want to thank the panelists for their presentations and the audience.